In millions of Indian homes, there is a small strip of tablets. It is simple, wrapped in paper, easy to miss. It costs around 40 rupees. For years, it has been a quick fix for headaches, long work days, and everyday pain. It is ordinary, familiar, and always within reach. The same global company that makes this affordable medicine also created a very different drug. This second medicine was not for a headache. It was for late-stage cancer, the kind that gives people only a little time left. This drug could give patients more time. Months could turn into years. It meant more moments with family, more chances to live, even when life was slipping away. But this time came at a cost that most people could not even imagine. Around 2,80,000 rupees every single month. For most families in India, this was not just expensive, it was impossible. It created a clear line between those who could pay for more time and those who could not, between those who could keep fighting and those who had no choice but to stop. This was not just about medicine anymore. It was about who gets to live. And if you really think about it, that doesn't feel right. So what does a country do when it is told that its people do not deserve to live? If that country is most countries, it protests. It writes letters. It negotiates for a small discount. It thanks the company for considering them at all. But India is not most countries, India thought. India strategized. Let's see what India did. But before we go further, a quick pause. A big thank you to our channel members. Your support truly means a lot and helps us keep going. If you've been watching our videos and haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. It genuinely helps us grow, and it allows us to keep telling stories like this. All right, nowhere's what India did next. India reached back into its own history and pulled out a weapon that had been waiting quietly for decades. To understand what happened next, it is necessary to travel back in time, not to 2008, but to 1970. India in 1970 was a young republic still finding its feet. Independence had come only 23 years earlier. The country was poor, enormous, and deeply aware of what it meant to be dependent on foreign powers. The British had ruled for nearly 2 centuries, and one of the many things they left behind was their patent law, a system that protected the inventions of wealthy Western companies and made it expensive, if not impossible, for ordinary Indians to access those inventions. In 1970, the Indian government made a decision that would quietly, slowly, profoundly change everything. They passed the Patents Act of 1970. At the time, few people outside legal and pharmaceutical circles paid much attention. There were no headlines screaming about a revolution in progress. There was no grand ceremony, just a piece of legislation, filed and signed and set into motion. But inside that legislation was a distinction so powerful, so cleverly constructed, that it would take decades for the Western pharmaceutical industry to fully understand what had been done to them. The distinction was this: product patents versus process patents. Here is what that means in plain language. Imagine a company invents a new kind of glass. Not ordinary glass, a specially engineered glass that is extraordinarily resistant to shattering. They patent it. In most countries, that patent covers the glass itself, the final product. It does not matter how someone else tries to make it. Even if a competitor discovers a cheaper, faster, more efficient method of producing the exact same glass with the exact same properties, they cannot do it. The original company owns the product. Full stop. This is a product patent. But India, in 1970, decided that for essential things, food, chemicals, medicines, this system was not acceptable. India said, in these categories, companies can only patent the process, the method, the how, not the what. The implications for the pharmaceutical industry were enormous. Under this system, if a Western company invented a new drug molecule and patented the method by which they made it, an Indian company could look at that same molecule, figure out a completely different way to manufacture it, and legally sell the final product. Same medicine, different recipe, perfectly legal. It was like telling a restaurant that they could patent their secret cooking technique, but not the dish itself. Someone else could cook the same dish using a different technique, and there was nothing you could do about it. Western pharma companies were furious. Indian scientists were inspired. Among those inspired scientists was a man named Dr. Yusuf Hamied. He was both a scientist and the head of an Indian pharmaceutical company called Cipla, a company that would become one of the most important names in the history of global medicine. Dr. Hamied understood what the Patents Act of 1970 had created. A legal door, wide open, waiting. Consider what happened with propranolol. This was a heart medication genuinely important, genuinely necessary for patients with cardiac conditions. It had been invented by a British company called Imperial Chemical Industries. In Britain, in America, in most of the developed world, this drug was expensive, patented, protected. But Dr. Hamied and his team at Cipla studied the molecule, worked out a different synthesis route, and began producing and selling the same medicine to Indians at a fraction of the original cost. It was completely legal. And this was only the beginning. What came next was even more remarkable, and it happened on the other side of the world in Africa, during one of the most devastating health crises in human history: HIV and AIDS. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the AIDS epidemic was consuming sub-Saharan Africa. Millions of people were dying. Millions more were infected. And the drug that could manage the disease, a combination treatment known as the triple drug cocktail, existed. It was being sold in the market at $12,000 per patient per year, roughly 10 lakh rupees annually for a single patient. For an African family earning a few $100s a year, this was not a medical option. It was a fantasy, an insult dressed up as a price tag. Cipla looked at this situation, and then Cipla did what Indian pharmaceutical companies had learned to do extraordinarily well. They reverse-engineered the triple drug cocktail. They found their own process, their own manufacturing route, their own way to the same molecule, and they offered it to the world for $1 per patient per day, around 60 rupees. To put that in perspective, a treatment that cost 32,000 rupees a month from Western companies now cost 60 rupees a day from India. The world did not know what to say. Some celebrated. Doctors Without Borders, aid organizations, African governments. They had been campaigning for years, begging Western companies to lower prices and getting polite rejections. And here was this company from India offering the same medicine for almost nothing. Some were outraged. Western pharmaceutical companies argued that this was theft, that it violated the spirit of international agreements, that it would kill innovation, that it set a dangerous precedent. But under Indian law, the Patents Act of 1970, it was entirely legal. That era became the golden age of Indian pharmaceutical manufacturing. Companies like Cipla, Dr. Reddy's, and Ranbaxy grew into giants. Their model was elegant in its simplicity. Find a drug that costs thousands of dollars in America, figure out a new process to make it, and sell it for $10 to the rest of the world. The developing world became India's grateful customer, and India became something it had never quite been before in the history of modern science: a lifeline. But nothing this significant lasts forever without being challenged. By the 1990s, India was no longer the isolated, self-sufficient economy it had tried to be in the decades after independence. The world had changed. Trade had globalized. And in 1991, India hit a wall. A financial wall so severe, so sudden, so terrifying in its implications that it reads today almost like a scene from a disaster film. India ran out of foreign exchange reserves. Not partially, not uncomfortably low. The country had enough reserves to cover perhaps 3 weeks of imports. That was it. 3 weeks. To survive, India had to take emergency action. The Reserve Bank of India secretly airlifted 47 tons of gold to the Bank of England, then another 20 tons to the Union Bank of Switzerland, pledged as collateral, in exchange for an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. A nation that had fought for its sovereignty, that had built its entire economic philosophy around self-reliance, had just quietly pawned its gold. The price of the rescue was an open economy. India had to liberalize, had to allow foreign investment, had to engage with international trade on terms that the rest of the world was setting. And so India joined the World Trade Organization in 1995, and the WTO had conditions. The central condition, the one that directly threatened everything Indian pharma had built, was the TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. It was, in plain terms, the Western pharmaceutical industry's list of demands dressed in diplomatic language. The core demand, if India wanted to participate in global trade, India had to recognize product patents for medicines. By 2005, the reverse engineering era, the golden age, had to end. Indian companies could no longer legally copy a Western drug molecule and sell it cheaply. The door that had been open since 1970 would be closed. Western pharmaceutical executives must have celebrated. After years of watching Indian companies undercut them, after years of watching their patented drugs sold for pennies by competitors in Mumbai and Hyderabad, they were finally going to get their system back. Or so they thought. India had a deadline. 2005. Introduce product patents. Play by Western rules. Let the global pharmaceutical order be restored. India met the deadline. India introduced product patents. But India also introduced something else. Something buried quietly inside the updated patent law. Something that looked like a technical clarification to those who did not understand it and looked like a catastrophe to those who did. Section 3D. To understand why Section 3D was so powerful, it is necessary to understand a game that Western pharmaceutical companies had been playing for years. It is called evergreening. A patent on a drug lasts 20 years. After 20 years, anyone can make a generic version. For a pharmaceutical company, this is the moment their billions in profits get competition. So the industry developed a strategy to prevent it. Minor modifications, tiny, almost meaningless chemical tweaks to an existing drug. Change the form slightly, alter the dosage, add a coating, then refile the patent, restart the 20-year clock. The medicine is essentially the same molecule, same function, same effect on the patient. But on paper, technically, it is new enough to get a new patent. This practice had been accepted in the United States, in Europe. In most of the Western world, evergreening was simply how the pharmaceutical business operated. Section 3D said, not in India. The law was specific, precise, almost surgically designed to stop evergreening in its tracks. It stated that a new version of an existing drug could not receive a patent in India unless it demonstrated significantly improved therapeutic effectiveness. In plain language, if your new drug does not actually work better for the patient, it does not get a new patent. It does not matter how many lawyers file how many documents. No real improvement, no new protection. This was a direct attack on one of the pharmaceutical industry's most profitable strategies. The war began almost immediately. The first major battle came from Novartis, a Swiss pharmaceutical giant with enormous resources and a long list of lawyers. Novartis had developed a drug called Glivec. It was a genuinely important cancer medication. The original molecule had been patented back in 1993. But in 1998, Novartis applied in India for a patent on a modified form of the same drug, a different crystalline structure that they argued was different enough to warrant new protection. In the United States, this kind of application would likely have sailed through. In India, the patent office said no. Section 3D, the modification did not show improved therapeutic efficacy. It was, in the view of Indian law, simply evergreening, a chemical disguise on an old drug. Novartis did not accept this quietly. Novartis sued. The legal battle that followed was long, expensive, and watched closely by pharmaceutical companies, governments, and patient advocacy groups across the entire world. Both sides understood that this was not just about one drug. It was about whether India's law would hold, whether a developing nation could write its own rules about medicine and make them stick against some of the most powerful corporate legal teams on earth. In 2013, after years of litigation, the Supreme Court of India issued its ruling. India won. The court sided with the Indian Patent Act. The new form of Glivec did not show the required improvement in therapeutic efficacy. The patent was denied. The consequence was immediate and tangible. The Novartis version of Glivec sold in India for over 1 lakh rupees per month. The Indian generic version, now freely manufacturable, sold for 8,000 rupees per month. For a patient with cancer, that difference is not statistical. That difference is whether you can afford to keep living. But even with Section 3D in place, even with the victories against evergreening, there remained a category of situation that no amount of patent reform could fully address. What about drugs that were legitimately patented? Not through evergreening, not through tricks, but genuinely new molecules developed by real research? What about cases where a dying patient could not wait 20 years for a patent to expire? What about Nexavar, Bayer's cancer drug, 2.8 lakh rupees per month, a legitimate patent, a genuine medicine? India had a third masterstroke waiting for exactly this kind of situation. It was called compulsory licensing, Section 84 of the Indian Patent Act. This provision was not invented by India. It existed within the framework of international trade agreements. But what India did with it, the courage with which India chose to use it, was unprecedented among developing nations. Compulsory licensing allows a government to instruct a patent-holding company to license its drug to a domestic manufacturer, even against the company's wishes, if 3 specific conditions are met. First, the medicine is not reaching the people who need it. The public's health needs are not being addressed. Second, the price of the medicine is not reasonably affordable for the population. Third, the drug is not being manufactured domestically. In the case of Nexavar, all 3 conditions were satisfied. Cancer patients across India could not access the drug. 2.8 lakh rupees per month was not reasonably affordable for the vast majority of Indians. And Bayer was not manufacturing Nexavar in India. The government invoked Section 84. An Indian company called Natco Pharma received the compulsory license to manufacture and sell Nexavar. The new price, 8,800 rupees per month, from 2.8 lakh to 8,800, a drop of 97%. Bayer was outraged. The international pharmaceutical community raised alarms. There were warnings about investment drying up. There were statements about the dangers to innovation. There were predictions of a domino effect that would unravel the entire global patent system. But India held firm, because India had looked at the situation clearly and decided, a patent is not more important than a human life. A corporate balance sheet is not more important than a patient's survival. And a country that can afford to let its citizens die to protect a foreign company's profit margin is not a country that has its priorities in order. This was the first time India had ever granted compulsory licensing for a pharmaceutical product, and it sent a message that echoed around the world. The combined effect of these 3 legal strategies, the Patents Act of 1970, Section 3D, and compulsory licensing, was nothing less than the creation of a pharmaceutical superpower from a country that most of the developed world had written off as too poor and too disorganized to matter on the global stage. India today is the 3rd largest pharmaceutical producer in the world by volume. Every year, India exports approximately $30 billion worth of medicines. Think about those numbers carefully, because they are not just economic statistics. They are lives. 40% of the medicines consumed in the United States of America, one of the wealthiest, most medically advanced countries in the world, are manufactured in India. American patients fill their prescriptions at American pharmacies and swallow pills made in Indian factories. The supply chain connecting an American cancer patient to their treatment runs through Mumbai, through Hyderabad, through Ahmedabad. 25% of the medicines used in the United Kingdom are made in India. 50% of the medicines used across Africa, a continent of over 1 billion people, dealing with enormous health challenges and limited resources, are made in India. And then there are the vaccines. 60% of the vaccines administered globally come from India. 60%. When the world faced the COVID-19 pandemic, when governments across every continent were scrambling to vaccinate their populations, when poorer nations feared being left behind in the rush for doses, it was India's pharmaceutical infrastructure that the world leaned on. the Serum Institute of India, Bharat Biotech, Indian manufacturing capacity, Indian scientific capability. The country that was told its people did not deserve an expensive cancer drug became the country supplying medicine and vaccines to the entire world. India did this because its cost base is genuinely competitive, operating at roughly 30% lower cost than manufacturers in the United States, and because decades of building pharmaceutical expertise turned India into a place where scientific talent, manufacturing skill, and legal strategic thinking all came together in one extraordinary industrial ecosystem. It is, by any measure, one of the most improbable success stories in the history of global industry. A country that went from importing medicines under foreign rule, to reverse engineering drugs under its own laws, to supplying the world's most powerful nations with the medicines their own people need to survive. But there is something that needs to be said here, because no honest story is without its complications. Beneath all this triumph, there is a vulnerability that very few people outside India, and perhaps not enough people inside India, fully appreciate. Look at the graph of India's pharmaceutical exports over the last 20 years. It climbs, steadily, impressively, year after year. The story is exactly what it appears to be. India making more medicines, India exporting more to the world, India growing into its role as the global pharmacy. Now look at something else. Look at the graph of active pharmaceutical ingredient imports into India from China. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, are the raw chemical components that make medicines work. They are the essential building blocks. Without them, the factories go quiet. The pills do not get made. The supply chain stops. India makes the medicines. But for a shocking number of those medicines, India depends on China for the ingredients. For some of the most commonly used antibiotics, penicillin, amoxicillin, azithromycin, India's dependence on Chinese AP runs between 90 and 100%. For the simple pain relievers that fill every medicine cabinet in every country that depends on Indian exports, ibuprofen, paracetamol, India imports more than 90% of the required input chemicals from China. How did this happen? In the 1990s, the Chinese government made a strategic decision to heavily subsidize its chemical manufacturing industry. The economics that followed were brutal in their simplicity. Chinese factories, backed by state money, could undercut Indian manufacturers so dramatically that it became cheaper for Indian pharmaceutical companies to simply stop making their own raw ingredients and buy them from China instead. For a period when the relationship between the two countries was stable and trade was flowing, this was a rational business decision. But it created a hidden dependency of staggering proportions. If trade between India and China were disrupted by a border conflict, by a diplomatic breakdown, by a pandemic emerging from any point in the supply chain, the pharmacy of the world would run out of the ingredients to make its medicines. Within days, the country that supplies 40% of American medicines, 50% of African medicines, 60% of global vaccines, that country's pharmaceutical production depends on chemical imports from a nation with which it has unresolved territorial disputes and a complex, often tense, political relationship. This is the hidden fragility inside the success story, the vulnerability that the pharmaceutical export charts do not show, the risk that every proud statistic about India's pharmaceutical achievements quietly carries inside it. To its credit, India has recognized this weakness, and India has begun to respond with the same kind of strategic clarity that built the pharmaceutical industry in the first place. The government launched what is called the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, PLI. It is, in essence, a financial counteroffensive against the dependency on Chinese APIs. Billions of dollars in incentives, directed specifically at encouraging Indian companies to restart the domestic manufacturing of bulk drugs and the raw ingredients that feed the pharmaceutical supply chain. Massive industrial parks, bulk drug parks, are being constructed, designed to house the kind of large-scale chemical manufacturing that India once did for itself before Chinese subsidies made it economically irrational. Fermentation plants for penicillin production, one of the most essential antibiotics in the world, are being built on Indian soil for the first time in years. This is not a quick fix. Rebuilding a supply chain that was dismantled over decades takes time, money, and industrial patience. The PLI scheme is a beginning, not a completion. But the direction is clear. India has understood the risk of depending on others for something as critical as medicine, and now it is trying to take that control back. This is not just about factories or policies. It is about making sure that when people need medicine, it is available and affordable. India has done it once before, and now it is trying to do it again.